Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining tonight's webinar. This webinar is intended for folks who've been engaged in important educational efforts and want to shift their focus more towards advocacy. Tory Smith, FOSNA's national organizer, is going to talk about the movement moment that we are currently in and look at South African anti-apartheid movement as an example. FOSNA's new executive director, Tarek Abuata, is with us to root us in liberation theology and acknowledge FOSNA's 20th year this year. Patricia Daugherty, a local group member in Sacramento, is going to talk about their advocacies there on the ground, advocacy efforts on the ground. And then Tory will talk about the difference between education and advocacy and possible goals that can be a part of your campaigns. And I'll wrap us up with some various efforts that are underway nationally now and how you can plug into those efforts. We hope we'll have time for questions and answers in the end. And as Jay explained a little bit ago, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box on the corner. You can even type them in early now and we'll just hold on to them and then go through them at the Q&A at the end. So thanks again for joining us this evening as we continue to strengthen our efforts towards a free Palestine. And we're going to start off. Did any of the presenters have anything to add to the welcome? Or Tory, do you want to get us started?
No, that sounded great. I don't know, Patricia or Tarek, did either of you have anything to add?
Oh, great, thank you.
Awesome, sounds good. Yeah, so I'm going to kind of start us out by kind of setting us in our political moment in time. So as of right now, just this past year, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the call to BDS, which was a huge, I think, turning moment for Palestine advocacy internationally. And so what I wanted to do is acknowledge that one of the very common political comparisons that we make with the situation in Israel-Palestine is with apartheid South Africa. They both come out of histories of structural and militarized injustice. They both had massive international solidarity that was critical in achieving liberation. And then they both were using the tactics of boycott, divestment or disinvestment, and sanctions. And so I think that the comparison between those things bears out in a lot of really similar ways. And I think it's sometimes useful for us to kind of zoom out for a second and take a look at the wider picture so we can understand the particular political moment that we exist in right now. And so let's rewind back in time, back to 1949, and right after the election of Prime Minister Daniel Malan and the National Party victory and the institutionalization of the program of apartheid in South Africa, the African National Congress declares this program of action, which is a series of nonviolent resistance movements that are happening in the late 40s, early 50s. And then, as a lot of you will remember, in response to the Sharpeville massacre, the ANC decided to substantially alter its tactics. And one of the ways that it did that was by sending one of its prime representatives, Oliver Tambo, abroad to begin working on international support in 1960. So Oliver Tambo is, I would say that probably the closest analog to him in the Palestinian solidarity movement would be someone like Omar Barghouti. This was really the first time that there had ever attempted to be kind of a large-scale international solidarity movement built around the globe to try and change the policy of a particular country. And so he starts out with going to the United Nations and the United Kingdom, and he essentially begs in front of them and totally falls flat on his face. The institutional support internationally for apartheid was too strong at that point, and so after he failed, he transitioned into grassroots awareness raising. And I think that one of the crucial elements to that was local activists outside of South Africa start working on raising public awareness about how apartheid is affecting Black South Africans and other non-white South Africans. And those connections start out in places like the civil rights and Black Power movement here in the United States. You know, the ANC had a long history of collaboration with the Palestinian Liberation Organization and other groups in the early 60s and other struggles, but, you know, branch out to become a more widely accepted cause for progressive and liberal organizations worldwide. There is a ton of education that happens about these sorts of the sorts of problems that are happening in apartheid South Africa. Films like My Song Goes Forth, Witness to Apartheid, or books like Cry the Beloved Country really raise awareness about what was happening in apartheid South Africa throughout the 60s and 70s. And so, you know, for 15 years, Oliver Tambo and the other Black South Africans and local activists on the ground are trying to raise awareness about how apartheid South Africa functions, why it's wrong, you know, trying to overcome the inertia of acceptance that apartheid South Africa had. And so with all of this, it kind of continues through the 60s and 70s, and then some of the initial victories start to happen on the advocacy ring towards the furthest left of a lot of the organizations. So we see Hampshire College divesting in 1977, the United Nations Security Council imposing an arms embargo in 1977, and then in 1978, San Francisco having its first municipal divestment from South Africa. You know, and I think a lot of that was also galvanized by the Soweto uprising and massacre of striking school children by the South African police force in 1976, which really highlighted the brutality of apartheid. And I think, you know, much in the same way that we've seen, you know, unfortunately, the massacres in Gaza as galvanization for our movement and really calling people to take action and drawing more people in. You know, and then by the 1980s, the stage is really set because of the education that happened for a lot of groups to start to take more direct action against the structures of international support for apartheid. So, you know, after the Black South African rejection of the 1983 Constitution attempting to whitewash apartheid, this really galvanized resistance for, you know, in the wider anti-apartheid movement worldwide. And because enough of an educated activist base was present to make a convincing case for the boycott of South Africa, these things were able to be put into practice and really start to gain some real campaign wins. You know, so because of all of the awareness raising that had been happening in the 60s and 70s, during the 80s and early 90s, we see all of these amazing victories, like the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which overrode a veto by Ronald Reagan, calling for a complete boycott of South Africa, you know, or Polaroid withdrawing from South Africa because of criticism over its participation in producing the hated passbooks that all Black South Africans had to carry. South Africa's expulsion from the Olympics, the Belhar Confession by the Dutch Reformed Church within South Africa, talking about the church's duty to witness to what was happening in South Africa. The UN resolution on the cultural, academic, and other and boycotts of South Africa, and really recognizing the cultural and academic realm as a realm to boycott. And then, you know, really the beginning of large-scale capital flight starting in 1985, and then finally, you know, ending apartheid in, you know, by the elections, first elections in 1994, you know. And so what we see is that education builds the base for effective advocacy to really take place. And I think that that's one of the critical lessons that we can take from, you know, the analogy of South African apartheid.
All right. Well, thank you. And really, I'm flattered to have our Sacramento group be highlighted as a group who's been moving from education to activism. I know we're not the only FOSNA group that's been engaged in activism. And I'm certainly no expert, but am learning all the time. And I guess that's my first message, that the path from education to activism is an evolving and creative learning experience. So our group formed as part of our Organizing for a Sabeel conference that took place in March of 2012. We were inspired to host the Sabeel conference because some of us attended a conference in San Anselmo that took place in 2010, and I see a few of you who hosted that conference are on this call. So I would just like to say, never underestimate what a conference can do and what trouble it can get you into as well. So I should say that we began our conference, the planning, knowing that we were going to go forward as a FOSNA group after the conference, and the central planners were already active on the issue in one way or another. So our group is composed of both secular and people of faith. So we identify our group as a Christian Voice for Palestine, and everyone's comfortable with that, even though we are both secular and people of faith. We essentially borrowed our mission statement from the NorCal group. Some of those folks are on this call as well. And part of that mission is to organize educational activities, but also we also stated our commitment to active engagement in BDS. And that's another message I'd like to convey, and that's that borrowing is good. It's not plagiarism when it's activism. So I think that the working mix of secular and faith can be complementary, but that's not always seems so obvious to us. And sometimes it's been a struggle, especially early on. For example, how do we get into different churches if only the few of us are, and half of those few are only our actual church attenders. And of course, the work in the pews is different than that in the streets, and being sensitive to that. And frankly, we've struggled at times how to keep the conversation going in the pews, and even how to get congregants to even come to educational events. But I think the times are changing, and that's helping us tremendously. And I think Tory related to us just how the times are right now. So at this point, our group is comprised of what we call liaisons in different area congregations and denominations. This facilitates sharing of resources, which has meant congregational study guides, the Kairos study guide, and also opportunities when a speaker is able to come to our area, we can share who's gonna host the speaker, as well as circulating and promoting action items, be they national action items or local in our case as well too. So it's created a growing network of people in area churches connected to educational and advocacy opportunities. Some of these liaisons we met because they attended our 2012 conference, but others we've come in contact with you as they've come to our events. So, and all of our events, we advertise as widely as possible to area churches, putting it on online calendars, Facebook, encouraging people to send them to their own lists. So at those events, we collect, those who want to give their contact information. We talk to new attendees and we follow up. So it's a slow but building process. To our secular side, our Sabeel group is fortunate to be part of a coalition. It's called the Sacramento Regional Coalition for Palestinian Rights. And I think that other FOSNA groups also work in coalition, and it's a good model. Our coalition keeps growing, but that's with active invitational outreach to others in our community. And these community groups and individuals, organizations come together as part of our coalition, agreeing on the central point of advocating for human rights, civil rights, equality and dignity for Palestinian people, and also implementation of international law, and essentially the points around BDS call. So there's different ways to build coalition. And one really great way is to do it around a campaign. It provides a focus and ways to make the issues relevant to the different players. Our group was very active in the SodaStream boycott, which I know others were as well. It allowed us to engage both in the churches and also in the secular realm. The campaign connected us globally and nationally, as well as to the interfaith SodaStream boycott. We created material, and as well, we availed ourselves to the material that was out there for us to use both in the faith and secular setting. So we promoted the Thirsting for Justice petition, which allowed us to combine both education and action. We also promoted the Pope petition, which allowed us to educate about Palestinian children detainees. as well as getting people involved in taking an action. Currently, we're in the middle of a G4S campaign. And because of the degree and scope of G4S's violations, we've been able to rally over 50 regional organizations to join our effort in urging our regional transit to not renew its contract with G4S. And these organizations have ranged from labor to environmental disabilities, rights activists, to actual churches and members of clergy. We created a petition, which FOSNA hosts for us, and this provides an educational vehicle as well as a simple action people can take. Those that are ready to take deeper involvement or further action are encouraged to write their own letter, come to transit board meetings, to speak at those meetings. Some have even taken on tabling and having the petition available in their church. Some of the liaisons have even managed to get the information into their church bulletins. So an important aspect of coalition building around a particular campaign is the effort to find what's mutually beneficial to the diverse organizations and groups' interests that you're bringing together. So what that means is that you're going to need to commit, one needs to commit to attending other groups' events and understanding their issues, their struggle, and as we can find common ground and mutuality in our work. This is where having variety of interests, experience, and strengths within your group is really helpful. Sit down and make a list of groups and people that you know who are involved in peace and social work, social justice work. Make an A and B list and figure out who are your most obvious allies. Begin talking with them now and see where your work might connect. So every community is different and the composition of our groups are different, but my message is to look around, tap your resources and contacts, don't miss any opportunity to get an email, to follow up, to share information, to invite, to even attend other groups' events. So I was invited to speak to show how one group can move from education to advocacy. But really, in truth, our group was formed with an advocacy objective. But I think any group can do that. Every educational event can have an advocacy element. And I think groups should be able to look to and count on FOSNA leadership and other FOSNA groups for information sharing, guidance, and even direction for their advocacy actions. I know that Rochelle is going to cover specific campaign ideas, and we here in Sacramento are happy to talk further to anyone who's considering a campaign. We've learned a lot, and wish sometimes we knew now, or we knew then what we know now. But we recognize that communities and situations are different, and what works in one place may not be directly transferable to someplace else, but we're happy to talk to any of you if we can be helpful. I guess I could add, I think it's good to start with something that's winnable, to tag along with a winnable campaign. SodaStream was like that, I think. But I think G4S also presents some potential wins, especially if it can be coupled with the for-profit prison industry and the recent divestment wins there. And now there's more and more material to draw on. One of the great things about these campaigns is that there is definitely an education component to them, but it's active education, and in that it needs to be taken out of the room and into the street, out to reaching out to other churches, potential allies, making contacts, sharing information, providing a simple ask, sign on, write a letter. Having other churches open up their venue or organizations open up their meeting space for an informational event, and asking them to also speak out. All these kinds of things can be done. I know that many are discouraged about working with our legislators, but I think a visit from a faith-based group to a district office is important, even if it's just once a year, followed by phone calls. And especially now around the anti-BDS legislation, I think this is really a critical time to get in to visit your state and federal electeds and connect with others who are concerned about this legislation as well. And I think Rochelle can help provide some context for our different regions. Lastly, I don't have to tell you that those of you who live in communities where Methodists, Presbyterians, and Unitarians are going to be holding their conferences in these upcoming months should consider volunteering to help on the ground. Much better than flying people in. So if you live in Portland, Columbus, Ohio, I think those folks could use you. So I think that's pretty much what I have to say. Thank you. And again, we're available here in Sacramento.
Great, thanks so much, Patricia. So Tarek, how are we doing on your sound?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I have moved to Texas, as you all know, and I think this issue has to deal with Ted Cruz in some way silencing me here. But I'm glad I'm back on. No, thank you all. I was just saying earlier, and I'm sorry I missed Patricia, your presentation. I was just saying earlier, it's a bit weird for me to be on cam presenting at a webinar. I'm just used to audiences and that interaction. But it's nice to at least see, names of people I recognize and those I don't. So I'm glad that you all have joined us in this effort. What I'll talk about, probably about 5 minutes. It shows 10 minutes, probably 5 minutes about very general background to Sabeel, FOSNA as a whole, our identity, and education, how that was done, and then moving into advocacy and what that represents to FOSNA as we commemorate 20 years anniversary of this year. So let me just start out by saying, just to give it a little bit of history, that in the movement growing, there were a couple of items that happened. One was the local Christians, as we all know, studying together to forge that Palestinian liberation theology, which in many ways upheld the gospel for freedom, for political, social, and economic oppression. And at the same time, even our name of Sabeel came from the Arabic, the way, as you all know, or some of you know, and also signifying a spring or channel of living water. And to me, both those things, even on a foundational level in our organization, defined both an education element as we study, as we look at our Bibles, as we also look at how can we walk in that way? How can we allow that spring to flow freely onto that rocks of injustice so we can work together on splitting it in half, if you will. So even the foundations of our organization started from that place of education and advocacy from our home base in Jerusalem. What I've seen objectives-wise defined in FOSNA, as I joined, because I was on the board, maybe some of you don't know, for a couple of years before being the ED. In joining the board, and this is before Rochelle and Tory came on, there were a couple of objectives that were mainly highlighted in our organization. One, education and promoting awareness and understanding of the occupation by fostering the relationship between North American Christians, or particularly US Christians, and indigenous Palestinians. There was also mixed element of education advocacy in cultivating the support of the churches through sponsoring regional conferences that many of you have helped to actually put together. I've been involved with the particularly DC local chapter and coalition on those conferences and speaking there a few times, I think 2 or 3 times. And also looking at pilgrimages, witness trips, international gatherings in Palestine. So that was a mix of both education elements and advocacy. And as we continue, I think a parallel on both elements, education and advocacy, we need to make both stronger. And particularly, I would say, from my point of view, the advocacy part. So in commemorating our spirituality as it is rooted in that Palestinian liberation theology, in Sabeel, Palestine, and also in commemorating 20 years of education and activism, how can we do advocacy and education that is relevant to today's civil rights struggles? And I do believe that FOSNA is the organization to do this work. Again, a connection to Palestine for 20 years, activism through many of you in the US for 20 years. And we also have a highly qualified and skilled staff to lead this work and efforts. So in addition to what was started out as advocacy and as education and some advocacy elements, we've then carried it on last year when we hired the national organizers into things like Zionism Unsettled, and also G4S activism, Soda Stream activism, the Pope Letter campaign. So stronger advocacy channels. And those you can read on. I'm not going to go through each one of them. I think some of you are familiar with them, and you can read more about them online. So at this point, I feel like we are even at a third stage into advocacy. And I do believe that it's a very pivotal time, both particularly as Christians and particularly in our churches. And I understand a lot of folks on here are not Christian or don't identify as Christian. And I know I'm speaking from that perspective, but also we have a lot of secular folks who are helping in churches, in local advocacy efforts. So at this point, the education has to continue because it's always a major element. We have to continue that education, and we also have to define liberation theology in a way that is both accessible and bolstering of intersectional work. And that necessitates stronger advocacy elements. So things as that Rochelle will expound on quite a bit is developing skills of local organizers through things like this webinar, one-on-one coaching with national organizers and conference attendance. How could we make our conferences focused on advocacy afterwards? How can we make our witness trips focused on advocacy afterwards? How can we launch and continue to launch municipal divestment campaigns and contribute to more local wins? How can we partner with major churches in representing the Palestinian voice and the Palestinian Christian voice at their church conferences? And how can we also support nonviolence activism on the ground with more advocacy on the ground as well? So we are connecting, and we need to raise the bar for me. I mean, I just wrap up by saying, for me, it's been an amazing work of the advocacy with all these efforts in creating a foundation and a strong foundation of that. And at this point, I think forming that house of advocacy that sits on that foundation, and that we'd always have to continue to look after that foundation, and also in building that home to become a true home of justice for us as FOSNA. That is all I have. I hope that was understandable and that you heard all of it. Check. I'll mute myself now.
Thanks so much, Tarek. Tory, do you want to continue?
Yeah. So, again, thanks so much for Tarek and Patricia for kind of giving us those great examples. And I think I really want to highlight something that Patricia said, was kind of like talking about how oftentimes, one of the things that I've heard when I've been in discussion with some of you, around this very question is like, we do advocacy because we have this belief that the reason why people are not taking action on Palestine right now is because they just don't know. They don't know what's happening there. And I think that that's partially true, but I think that what Patricia said is like the most effective education sometimes comes when you're actually taking action. And I think that that is absolutely true. And it's really setting, this educational framework. We don't abandon it when we move into advocacy. It's education sets the framework for what our advocacy can then become. It's seeding the places where we can start to take action, and really build the awareness. So I'm going to go through like a little bit of like what's the difference between those two. And then kind of move a little bit further into that. So I would say that like one of the first questions is like, why do we focus on education versus why do we focus on advocacy? I think that everybody starts to do educational type work as a Sabeel chapter because you want to raise awareness about what's happening in Israel-Palestine, and you want to bring up some of the issues. And the difference in between education and advocacy is not necessarily in between the day-to-day activities, but what the long-term goals are. So your advocacy checklist that you should be thinking about in terms of what are the important things that we should be monitoring is is advocacy building local political power, which is accountable to you as a constituency in an arena where you didn't have it before. Second, is it working towards a common goal with new groups of people that you have not worked with previously? 3, does it have a clear end goal that is time bound? Does it have a goal where you can all acknowledge that once we've crossed this point, we have won this particular section, and we are going to do this within this period of time, and that could be years, but making sure that you have a deadline for that. And then finally, creating events which are unique enough to generate media interest. I'm sure that everybody on this call has struggled with generating media interest around their various events. And a lot of times it's because our events that we're doing are similar enough to events that have happened previously where it doesn't really generate a lot of media interest. So I would say that like all of the work that the educational work where you're branching out into the community, has been really critical to advancing like Friends of Sabeel North America nationally, to the point where we can start to engage on some of these campaigns, like the municipal divestment stuff that Rochelle is doing, or the G4S campaigns, the UN letter, the Pope letter, and all of those things that we're able to do now. That was only possible because of the education that happened for years and years and years before those moments to really spread awareness about the issue. I would say that like one of the ways that I, look at the question of like when do we switch from a group that's primarily doing an education to also doing advocacy as well as education, is it's going to look different for every group. If you're in an urban location, that timeline is going to look different than if you're in a more rural area. If you live in kind of the more kind of liberal north, it's going to like look different than if you're living in the more conservative south. But as a general rule, it's almost always sooner than you think it's going to need to be. A good rule for this that I personally follow is, if you're holding educational events and you get like 90% of the same crowd at each educational event, that is your choir, and you have been preaching to it. And if that continues for 6 months or something like that, you have reached probably a critical mass of people who have been educated enough on the issue that you could start to take action. Educational efforts are almost always open-ended. They're pushing towards creating enough of a base of knowledge for a group to take action, whereas advocacy efforts are always time-bound. It's not about the kind of general, like, if people will know more, then they'll take action. It's, we want to accomplish this X goal within the next 6 months, year, 2 years, whatever. And so those distinctions, I think, are really the important parts that we look to in terms of kind of examining what is the difference between doing just an educational work and doing education and advocacy at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rochelle.
Great, thanks. I'm not muted this time. So I'm going to talk briefly about advocacy efforts that are underway currently and how folks can plug into those. Given our accountability to Palestinian civil society, we respect their leadership. So almost all these advocacy campaigns currently are a response to the 2005 call for the international community to participate in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement. BDS has long been an important tool of social movements, including abolitionists used it to protest slavery, civil rights activists to demand an end to segregation. In the 60s, labor organizers used it to demand collective rights for farm workers. And as Tory talked about in the beginning, global civil society used it to call for an end to apartheid in South Africa. So FOSNA has chosen to focus on supporting municipal boycott and divestment campaigns this year, one of our advocacy focus areas. These campaigns give us a powerful opportunity to look at how institutions in our own communities are benefiting from the occupation through investing in or contracting with companies that are making profit off of the occupation. These campaigns can lead to very powerful educational opportunities, both through public hearings and often because they reach local media, and local news will cover an effort like this in one way or another. I'm sure, as others have referred to, often we've all experienced having educational events with the same folks. But I have seen on multiple occasions, by starting BDS campaigns, often people feel more impacted by it because it's for example, in a municipal campaign, it's something that their own local government is considering. And so then they feel a more direct impact to it, and often will more likely pay attention and attend events and get involved, especially if you have a campaign victory. It's incredible to see in my few experiences with campaign victories, the increase in participation in all the education events that happens after that. These municipal campaigns, and Patricia talked about this already, but will likely be more successful when we work in coalition with other struggles. And that's one of the reasons FOSNA chose G4S as one of the corporations that we are emphasizing cities to drop contracts with, because of their involvement with Israeli prisons. And I think many of you know this, but just to go over some of the areas in which G4S provides strong opportunities for coalition building. G4S is also involved in deporting immigrants through a federal contract that they have with ICE, and they run private for-profit prisons in the US. Working in coalition with these other struggles on these municipal campaigns broadens our educational reach, and it also educates us on the interconnections between our struggles. I wanted to mention, for those of you that are interested in or are already starting a municipal campaign, there's a webinar on Monday that the U.S. Campaign to End the Occupation is hosting, Monday the 8th at 5:30 Pacific time and 8:30 Eastern time. And you can sign up on their website. It's on the front page of their website, and I'll send out a link in an email to everyone who participated on this webinar as well. And you can also send an email to myself or to Tory, and we can talk to you about how to start municipal campaigns in your areas and work through kind of step by step. Now that I've been assisting 4 different efforts, I'm really learning a lot, and I'm excited to share all the lessons learned I've heard from amazing organizers on the ground like Patricia and others with those of you that are just beginning new campaigns. I wanted to also, for those of you that a municipal campaign feels like too much maybe to begin with, I want to talk about other advocacy campaigns that FOSNA and other groups are currently actively working on that groups could engage in. And I will send this list an email with a contact for each campaign, so you can reach out yourself and connect with the organizers that are working on it. So one effort that FOSNA is also involved in is the UN Drop G4S campaign. And this is a campaign to pressure the UN to drop their over $22 million worth of contracts with G4S because of their role in human rights abuses in Israeli prisons and, as I mentioned, beyond. FOSNA is currently, and we have been for several months, but we want to continue to gather signatures of clergy onto a letter that you can find on our website, which will be delivered to the UN office in New York, urging the UN to drop G4S. So we could definitely use help in gathering those signatures, and there's many ways in which people could plug into that campaign. There's congressional advocacy through No Way to Treat a Child, which is led by the American Friends Service Committee and Defense of Children International. And that campaign aims to expose the practice and impact of Israeli military detention on Palestinian children, and specifically reaching out to elected officials in order to hold Israel accountable to international law. And again, I'll send these links out, but you can find that on the American Friends Service Committee page website. Also, the campaign against, that Patricia mentioned, the wave of anti-BDS legislation that's currently spreading through the US at a state and also at a federal level. There are loose coalitions forming across the country to respond to these pieces of legislation as they're brought to the table. And so that's a great way you can do a lot of various forms of outreach to gather letters and opposition to the legislation and to reach out to your legislators as well. So there's many different ways you can plug in. Ben and Jerry's out of Israel's illegal settlement campaign, which is out of Vermont. It's through Vermonters for a Just Peace in Palestine and Israel, and they're looking for more groups to support their effort to try to get Ben and Jerry's to stop selling in the illegal settlements. And then I also wanted to mention the recent Airbnb Stolen Homes campaign. That's also a coalition led by JVP and some other Code Pink and other groups that's demanding Airbnb to stop renting rooms and vacation homes in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So again, I'll share all these out by email tomorrow with the contact information. And that wraps up our presentation for the webinar. So let's open it up for questions. You can type any questions you have in the chat box, like we talked about earlier, or you could also send an email again to Rochelle, ROCHELLE @FOSNA.org if you're participating over the phone. So I see the first question. I'll reread it and then you all can decide who would like to respond. Paul is asking, what about working in coalition and solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and especially with the African American Church and their issues? Anybody want to take that question?
Great. I mean, if you can find,
Go ahead, Patricia, that's great.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, yes, if you've got contacts and can find the ways in which you can work, come together and have mutually beneficial relationship moving forward, all of our issues.
Yeah, I would just add on to that, Paul, that I think that we've already seen through the hashtag Black for Palestine, the incredible work that people that are doing on the ground in places like Ferguson to build Black Palestinian solidarity, that there has been an incredible amount of stuff that's already been happening in terms of building Black Palestinian solidarity. I think that especially issues around incarceration and police militarization are of extreme importance to the African American community right now. And I think that has been something that we've been seeing tremendous work done. Our Chicago chapter right now is working with groups like Black Youth Project 100 around the campaign around G4S secured juvenile detention facility in the area. And so I think that there's obviously a lot of crossover in between the ways that state violence is structured inside of Israel and then state violence is structured inside of the US. And we know for a fact that there is a lot of information and tactics exchange in between those two countries in terms of the ways that we do that. I would also say that it's very important when we are approaching these groups, not to just approach them as, hey, we heard that you're working on this thing. Do you want to help us? Will you help us with this? We want to make sure that we're building very solid relationships with them first, and then often that involves a great deal of listening before we even make an ask for them. That's going to depend on the individual relationship with each of you, with your local community there, which is obviously going to look different depending on where you are. So I know, for example, for DC, I think that y'all have done incredible work with building up with people like Reverend Graylin Hagler and others. And so I think that has been really invaluable in terms of that. But yeah, making sure that we're taking the lead in terms of other organizers and not trying to shoehorn in Palestine, but seeing the ways that Palestine naturally arises within these contexts that we can join these messages.
I also, just to add, I think it's important right now when so often Black Lives Matter or organizations that are working on those issues are so beyond capacity right now that oftentimes really thinking creatively in your group about how they could engage and how you could work in coalition that wouldn't require them coming to your meetings or an ask that takes a lot of capacity. Is there a way that here locally a campaign we're working on in Oakland, we're meeting with those groups individually, asking for them to, if they support this effort, asking for their important input on the resolutions that we're working on and the various pieces of the campaign, the messaging and whatnot, but doing most of the actual groundwork and grunt work ourselves, because we do have a lot more capacity and a lot, folks who have time to put into the efforts. So being creative about how those coalitions look, I think also is helpful. So I see the next question, Catherine from Oakland. Please talk about challenges you faced when building coalitions and how you've dealt with them. So we sort of maybe answered some of that just now. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Is there anything, Patricia, from Sacramento that comes to mind in challenges you faced in coalition building around your current effort?
Well, I mean, I guess we have had some, so for our G4S campaign, for example, we've wanted to add voices from people who are involved in the anti-for-profit prison activism. But we've had trouble. There's been some successes. There was the one with the Regents of California, the University of California, but people, as Rochelle was saying, they're busy, and so it's not necessarily possible for them to come, break off and help our campaign. They're now moving on to the Wells Fargo, trying to get Wells Fargo to drop G4S. So I guess it takes time, and again, it's again, you have to find where the crossover and the mutual benefit really is. And so sometimes it's not always obvious at first, so it can be a challenge.
Great.
And again, the people power and what works for them as well as for us. So.
Yeah, I would just add one quick thing before we go to the next question, which is one of the things that a lot of us are involved in this work because we care very passionately about the Palestinian cause, and we have, I think, a really strong urge to continue to raise awareness about that. And I think that one of the really hard things about working in coalition is working with the fact that the Palestinian message is not always going to be in the forefront of that, and really being aware of how much space y'all are taking up vis-a-vis your other coalition partners, and allowing them equal time on the mic, even though for that particular campaign you might be providing more grunt work. This might be more directly involved in Palestine issues, but it's also making sure that we give space for each of these communities to talk about some of this. One of the groups that's been really active on the G4S issue has been immigrant groups as well, because G4S provides immigration and customs enforcement and customs and border protection with the actual buses that they use to deport migrants back across the border. And that, those communities are just as affected by, in some ways, G4S, and its activities than the Palestinians. And even though a lot of the main bodies of groups that are working on G4S in Arizona and New Mexico have been Palestinian groups, being really intentional about maintaining an equal time to give that message in whatever opportunity that you have publicly, I think is one of those things where it's hard to realize, but I think it's very, very important.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I think our next question is from Najwa. Israel seems to be winning the media campaign to define every Palestinian they execute on the streets as a terrorist. How can we help bring out a broader perspective similar to the skepticism about police killings in this country? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. Patricia or Rochelle?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, but this is a big question, I think something we should all spend some time chewing on and think about, especially through our advocacy efforts. So the piece that I feel like is always missing is the Palestinian voice itself, hearing directly from some of the young folks who are who are being executed now, who are resisting. I just today shared an article from Electronic Intifada that did interview a series of folks in the West Bank about the situation. So I think one important piece is figuring out how to get the actual voices from Palestine into our media and to be heard, and that's challenging. I think we're doing a really good job in alternative media and doing that, Mondoweiss and Electronic Intifada and whatnot, but how we spread that farther, I think, is something we need to continue to work on. And I think when you do get an opportunity through an advocacy campaign, when you do get a moment of attention or media, making sure that your press releases are really powerful and do include that voice and take an opportunity to try to reframe things, as much as possible, I think is important.
Yeah, and there's also, go ahead, Patricia.
Oh, well, I would just second that. I mean, what came to mind for me, I'm involved in something else besides FOSNA, and that we have a sister city relationship with Bethlehem. And that's one of our efforts, is to bring the human face in a way that's, different than just the news that people hear. So they see Palestinians as human beings. The other thing that I thought of, though, that's tricky in terms of making that connection, it has to be very, very sincere. So we can't use what's happening to people in our country who are being shot by, the police brutality. It has to be a very sincere connection, and we have to stick with it too. So that, you know what I mean. So we don't want to just make those connections just for our own uses.
Yeah, I think this was the point that Patricia raises is like an extremely important one. I think that oftentimes we see like stuff like people creating the hashtag like Palestinian Lives Matter or something like that. And really what we've been, hearing from organizers on the ground is that when that happens, they feel like their message about Black Lives Matter is being hijacked in this method. And I think that one of the things is we need to be really cognizant of the ways that these things are different in some ways, and that both like that the United States is entirely capable of oppressing Black people, even if Israel didn't exist, and has been doing it since long before Israel existed, and will, and so it's one of those things where I think that we need to be really cognizant about when we try to latch onto things that are ascending in the media moment, that we do so in a very cognizant way, in a way that like this is how this relates, not this is the same thing. I think that's really important. I would also say that there are also a bunch of organizations out there that are doing really incredible media work around this, in terms of generating kind of mainstream media coverage. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute for Middle East Understanding, the IMEU is a really amazing organization that really focuses on raising the profile of Palestinians and humanizing them within the kind of wider media circles. And they have a bunch of really excellent resources on their website as well. Rochelle will include that in your e-blast for tomorrow, in terms of how we humanize Palestinians through a media landscape that is unfriendly to the Palestinian narrative, and how do we insert that anyway.
All right, the next question I see here from Athena. Rochelle, I've never done any advocacy and I don't know where to start. Could you send something about how to get started in the most basic beginner's way, advocacy for dummies? What I'd recommend is I can probably get your contact information from Jay, our tech who set up this webinar, but I think what would be great is for you and I to have a phone call and talk through it a little bit, see where you live and what opportunities might exist already that you could plug into as a way to learn. So thanks for that very honest question, and I look forward to speaking to you about it. Tory, you want to read the next question?
Yeah. So this is from Pat from Iowa City. What about legislative advocacy? Also, propositions that can be sent to platform committees of political parties to become part of that party's platform. Also, divestment resolutions in many churches that are making their way to the conference votes. Can you talk more about these things? And I think we're running up on an hour at this point, so maybe we'll just take one or two more questions after this, and then call it. I will say that given the current political moment, this is a very Iowa question. Yeah, I think that there are really, really good ways that legislatively some of this stuff has been being advanced. I would say that probably the most successful over the past year has been the joint AFSC Defense for Children International No Way to Treat a Child campaign, which has really raised the issue of child detention on Capitol Hill, and I think brought it in a really, really effective way. I think it kind of depends on the individual motivations of your group. I know some people are certainly more inclined towards legislative action and trying to take action through those means and that kind of thing. I'm sure that all of us have at one point talked to our congressman, and probably I'm guessing for the majority of you, unless you happen to be living, under a congressman like Keith Ellison or someone else, have been running up against the kind of legislative brick wall around these issues. I think that one of the reasons why BDS has taken on in such a serious way here in the United States is it's a way for people to take action outside of the political system. And I think especially with a lot of these local government contracts, and raising this issue on a very hyper local level, it's partially because we don't see AIPAC or CUFI really lobbying these local government officials very heavily at all. It's all concentrated up on the national level, not down on the local level. So in some ways, we're stepping into a political power vacuum when we do enter into those spaces to try and raise some of those messages. So I would say that that is also a way that you can get involved governmentally, but not just going immediately to Congress and trying to ask for a weapons embargo on Israel or something like that. But taking these small incremental steps that will help start to build a larger grassroots consensus around these issues. And then for the divestment resolutions, Rochelle, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. And Patricia spoke about it a little bit in the webinar, but there are three denominations that will be voting on divestment resolutions this year. The Methodist, Presbyterian, and Unitarian. And there are ways people can support those efforts, of course, within your own denomination. But also, as Patricia mentioned, if you're on the ground in one of the communities where the General Assemblies or conferences are occurring, which this year will be Presbyterian and Methodist gatherings will be in Portland, Oregon, and the Unitarian will be in Columbus, Ohio. So I think, and of course, considering bringing forth and working within your denomination to bring new resolutions forward and working with the pens, depending on your denomination, to make that happen and continue this momentum that's spreading. So, and at FOSNA, we're going to have a new page soon on our website that will have all the different pens and different networks that work on these issues within the denominations and their contact information, as well as we'll be linking to the great spreadsheet that the U.S. campaign has of all of the church divestment wins that have happened already. And we'll try to have more of a base for people to see what's going on and plug into on our website. And I'm sure we'll share that through our e-blasts. So do join the FOSNA list on our website if you're not currently on it. Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Patricia, about the divestment, church divestment efforts?
I think you covered it. Yeah. Well, also too, but I guess just one more thing. If you are in any of those denominations, just talking up the resolutions in your congregations, letting people know about it. I mean, it is surprising even within the denominations that they don't necessarily know. So there's an education moment there, just and then an advocacy component too, because they can talk to delegates, and I think perhaps delegates possibly listen more to people of their own denomination. So there's and especially if any of you, especially if any of you have
delegates to any of these conferences that are going from your local congregations, especially forming a relationship with them early on and talking to them can do worlds more than we can do during the week or so of the General Assembly itself.
Or if you're in a congregation of the Unitarian Universalists, they haven't even selected their delegates yet for this upcoming conference. So consider becoming a delegate as well. I think you can
help us stack the vote.
And we should have mentioned all these campaigns have challenges, reasons that some are better, or reasons that they're strong and reasons that they're weak. And I think if you are considering doing an advocacy campaign and you're not sure which, feel free to give us a call and we could talk through some of the strengths and weaknesses of the different campaigns, and you could look at the specificity of your local community and try to see what might be the best fit for you all moving forward. So great. Well, thank you everyone for participating in this webinar. There will be a survey that comes out as well, and do take the time to give us input on what future webinars you'd like to see. We've committed to doing these every 2 months this year, and we would love to have your feedback. We have a list that came from last webinar's survey, but we would love to hear more opinions on what feels important at this moment to be covering, and faces you'd like to see. We don't want it to just be Tory and I. It's been wonderful to have Patricia and Tarek, but next time we hope to bring many more new faces to lead these webinars and knowledge to be shared. So thanks again. Anyone else, any concluding points?
No, I think you wrapped it up. Thanks so much, Rochelle.
Thanks for your holy silence, Tarek. We'll work on the technology for the next conference. Take care all.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
I know.